Channel 6, this is Action News Issues and Answers, a weekly interview program with the Delaware Valley's most talked about newsmakers. And now, here's Jim Gardner.
Good morning and welcome to our program. Our guest today, Senator Arlen Specter, who is, of course, running for re-election, trying to stave off the challenge of Lynn Yackel, who has become something of a political star in her own right, given all the attention that she is getting. Senator Specter, one of the more experienced and by common consensus, one of the harder workers in the United States Senate. And it's going to be a fascinating contest as we get past Labor Day and into the fall season. Senator Specter, our guest today on the program. Vernon Odom joins us today. Vernon?
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, Senator. Senator, last week in Salt Lake City, the insurgents, I'll call them, in the Republican Party, pro-abortion rights, held a bitter battle with the party over the platform and what they're going to put out this summer in Texas. Do you support them, the insurgents and the pro-abortion rightists, who want to open up the party platform?
Yes.
And do you want them to have a divisive battle at the convention this summer that could divide the party, which is having trouble already?
Vernon, my preference would be to leave the abortion issue out of politics totally. I don't think it belongs in politics. I don't like abortion, but I think it's something for the family. I think it's something for churches, synagogues, ministers, rabbis, priests. I don't think it has any place in politics.
Will you actively support that group this summer in Houston as they try to wage that battle?
I will support a movement to take the controversy of abortion out of any party platform and out of government, because I don't think government has a thing to do with it.
Yet you met a few weeks ago with a bitter political opponent, Stephen Friend, and others, trying to rally them to your side. What were you able to offer them that would make them come to your side after a bitter issue like abortion?
I met with my opponent in the primary and people who were against me in an effort to pull the party together, to have party unity. I face a very difficult election. I acknowledge that. I'm working very hard on it. And I think I'm entitled to have a unified party if I can do so. But I offered them absolutely nothing. I have been pro-choice right down the line all the time. Since I was district attorney, my full tenure in the Senate, I have favored it unequivocally.
Most of them appeared to have walked out saying, no way I can get along with Arlen Specter. Do you think it was the wise thing to do to try to bring them in? Because that gives others openings to say, there he goes again.
Well, when I went again, there he goes again with something on entirely appropriate. And I think that most people within the Republican Party will support me on my own record, because there's a lot more to being a United States Senator than a single issue, whether it's abortion or whether it's a single issue that my opponent is pushing in the general election. Being a senator has a lot to it, and I think in the long run I will be successful in having a reasonably unified party.
The abortion issue underscores what seems to be a growing phenomenon that women are in increasing numbers looking to women to be their representatives in 1992. Record numbers of women are running for federal elective office, and many people think that record numbers of women will win. How vulnerable do you think you are, and be candid with us if you would, with this issue, particularly in the aftermath of the Anita Hill incident?
Well, Jim, I do not think I am at all vulnerable on women's issues, because I have been so very, very strong. I have been pro-choice. I have supported the Equal Rights Amendment. I was the leader on the Senate floor against the gag rule, which limited the doctor's advice with respect to all of the options. I have been a leader on women's health issues long before the Hill-Thomas hearings. It was my leadership that brought a 46% increase for funding for breast cancer, and that if you put Hill-Thomas aside, I have a record which is unparalleled. Nobody in the 99 other senators or 435 House members has a better record. And when it comes to Hill-Thomas, I think, too, that that is a matter which is not going to be a focus of attention in November. I have been candid to say that I understand the problems of sexual harassment, because so many women either have been victimized by it themselves or know someone who has. And I did take the position on national television that we should have extended the hearings, We should have heard women testify on sexual harassment to give a broader base. But I think it is coming through that when my opponent won the primary on that single issue alone, that people are now beginning to say, hey, wait a minute, how about the economy and what I've been doing there, or on housing, or on job training, or on affordable health care, or crime control, or environmental protection, so that women are interested in these broad range of issues. On women's issues, I've been very strong, but there's a lot more to being a senator.
That is your record on women's issues. And then there is the perception of Arlen Specter sitting at the table with the rest of the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And there are those people who watched those hearings who thought that you were inordinately tough, insensitive, and that the specter of Anita Hill going up against this all-male cast was something that in and of itself defined the problems of almost male exclusivity in the United States Senate. And clearly that image, as used in a commercial for Lynn Yackel, contributed to her spectacular victory. Why do you think that, despite the fact that your record says this, you may not be vulnerable from a perception standpoint?
Because during the course of the campaign, I think that people will learn more about the details of my record. Many people do not know, for example, the leadership role I've had on women's health issues, the increased funding for breast cancer and ovarian cancer. Many people do not know that I led the fight along with Senator Chafee and Senator Harkin on the Senate floor on the gag rule issue to have women advised of what they can do, that I have been very, very supportive and a leader pro-choice. And I think, Jim, when you point out that women look to women, I think that is fine, but I think that Americans and Pennsylvanians will not elect someone just on the basis of gender. And what I like to do is to simplify it into two pronouns. And this is an oversimplification, but this is how I start. It's her or me. And I think it is a matter of who can do the better job. And my knowledge of Pennsylvania and problems of the Naval Air Development Center in Bucks County, or visiting the jail in Montgomery County, or what I've done in Delaware County on the V-22 with jobs at Boeing, or the fight that we're successful so far in the early stages to keep the Navy Yard here, and what I'm doing for summer employment. Talked to Ed Rendell just on Friday, met with Superintendent Dr. Constance Clayton on the education issue, working on housing, matters of enormous importance to this entire region. That is what people will look to when we really move through a campaign.
Can't the case be made, however, that the more you talk about your record, the more you point out or emphasize your incumbency, and in this year, when incumbency is not necessarily a positive attribute for a candidate to trumpet throughout the legions of the body politic, that may work to your disadvantage as well. We need fresh blood. We need a fresh face. Let's get the incumbents out of here.
Jim, I've got fresh blood, and I've even got a fresh face. But,
looks the same to me.
Well, that's good. That means it's still fresh if it looks the same. But you see, Jim, people are wary of incumbents who move to Washington and forget about their districts or their state. But I live in Pennsylvania. I live right across the river here. I spend 4 days a week in Pennsylvania all the time, and in recesses I'm in this state consistently. I've been in every county of the state many, many times, so I have attended to the duties. And when it comes up to being on the Appropriations Committee and seniority, let me give you a specific illustration. I was talking to Mayor Rendell. Ed Rendell and I go back a long time. He was an assistant DA. And the key issue for keeping the lid on this summer are youth jobs. And I've been working to try to get a $700 million appropriation, which would hire about 5,500 more summer jobs. And Mayor Rendell said to me, Arlen, Gephardt is for us. He's the number 2 man in the House. Will he be in a position to help out? And I said, no, I'm sorry, he won't, Ed. He said, well, why not? And I said, well, he's not on the conference committee, Appropriations Conference Committee. And Ed said, well, who is? And I said, I am, Ed. You have to be in the Senate a long time and be on the Appropriations Committee to be able to be there when we really start to make the critical decisions. And I think when people focus on that, they will say, well, even those who will disagree with you about my fresh face.
On the Supreme Court, Senator, Ms. Yackel points out that with the exception of Bork, you supported all the Reagan-Bush nominees who now appear ready to kill off Roe v. Wade. How do you respond to that one? You've supported each and every one of them.
I respond to that my opposition to Judge Bork is a pretty big point that really establishes frontally my independence. And I say beyond that, Vernon, that I'm not going to select someone based on a single issue. I don't think that's the way you select people. And most importantly, let me bring this to your attention. If you take somebody like Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was known to be pro-life, everybody in the Senate supported Anthony Kennedy for Supreme Court, including Barbara Mikulski, a woman who's strong pro-choice, Kennedy, Metzenbaum, Simon. Everybody supported Anthony Kennedy, so that when you say that you support someone who may be on one issue contrary to what you think, that's a solid senatorial position for everyone, not just me.
You supported Clarence Thomas, who, since he's gone in, has voted against a key element in the Voting Rights Act of the mid-'60s. He voted, for example, to say that a black person elected to office in the Deep South, or a majority population has the right, or politicians have the right, to lessen the power of a public official elected. You know the battles that have gone on in the Deep South. Mr. Thomas, I would think, should know them too, but many in the civil rights movement question that. And now you've seen the rollback in the Supreme Court there. Are you proud of that?
I am not happy with what Justice Thomas has done so far, but he's been on the court for a very short period of time. If you took a look at what Justice William O. Douglas did in his first couple of years on the court, it was not a very good record. It was for eavesdropping, was not a civil libertarian. I said categorically when then Judge Thomas was nominated, that he was not the best person for the job. They said, who was? Well, I said, start with Bill Coleman. I also disagreed with President Bush when he said race was not a factor. I said race was a factor, and I think an appropriate factor. I don't think you should have a Supreme Court of the United States with at least one African American. But I think Justice Thomas was qualified, is qualified. I got to know him a little bit.
But he's been following Scalia almost down the line, and that's somebody else you voted for in what's considered an attack on civil rights.
Hey, wait a minute. He hasn't followed Scalia down the line. He's differed with Scalia on a number of points. And let me say to you, on Scalia, it was 99-0. Kennedy supported Scalia. Metzenbaum supported Scalia. Everybody in the Senate supported Scalia. So when people say, hey, why does Arlen Specter support Scalia or support Anthony Kennedy? It was unanimous. We do not select Supreme Court justices based on a single issue, and I don't think we ought to select senators based on a single issue. Just not the way we do it in America.
We'll continue with our conversation with Senator Specter in just a moment.
They always fall for men who are like their dads, in all the wrong ways.
I wanted a man's attention all my life. Negative was fine as long as I got attention.
Your father's in jail now, and your fiancé is in jail now.
And she calls me and says, oh, Mother, I don't believe it. It's spring. Ben's going to jail. And I said, well, what's the big deal? Your dad always went every fall.
Why we look for a man who's just like our dad on the next opening. Tomorrow at 4, followed by Action News at 5, right here on Channel 6.
That's my sister. That's me. And that's Mom getting her lark. When we gave her lark last year, we never imagined how much it would change her life. That's Danny and Courtney, and that's Mom at the zoo. She even takes her lark to the mall and the grocery store. She doesn't get tired anymore because she's not walking so much. We just pack that lark in the trunk of her car, and she's off. With the lark, she's going places and doing things we never thought she could ever do again. She's so independent. Giving Mom the lark was like giving her her life back. And that really feels good.
Lark can be the gift of life for someone you care about, or maybe even for yourself. For a free color lark brochure, call Lark of America at 1-800-554-6300. That's 1-800-554-6300.
want to ask you a question about Perot, Bush, and Clinton, and this does have some application to your contest with Lynn Yackel. What does it say about, number one, our system of government, number two, the electorate, that at this point in time, and it's obviously very early, all the polls we're seeing show Ross Perot doing extraordinarily well in many states, leading President Bush and Democrat Clinton, and yet most of the people who will cast their votes in November know virtually nothing about him. What does that say about us all?
I think it says, Jim, that the American people are very fed up with the kind of gridlock that they have in Washington. And a number of us have been trying to undo that gridlock to move ahead with some important legislation. But I think it says that people are dissatisfied with what President Bush has done. I think that's true. That there's dissatisfaction. They look at Governor Clinton and are dissatisfied. And he's an interesting alternative. He is really untested, and it's very speculative as to what's going to happen. We really have no precedents to guide us. My own speculation, for whatever it's worth, is that as we know more and more about Ross Perot, that he'll be less attractive.
You say people are dissatisfied with the gridlock. Another way of interpreting that statement perhaps might be people are dissatisfied with the establishment, the political establishment in Washington. Aren't you part of that gridlock? Aren't you part of the political establishment? Might not people be dissatisfied with you simply because you're there?
And Jim, I think that I have been a very independent voice in Washington. Talked about Bork before, an independent voice. Talk about the MX and move away from heavy defense spending, an independent voice. Talk about speaking up for the cities in a Republican caucus where it's very unpopular, an independent voice. We have a gridlock right now on the number one issue, and that is the economy. And Senator Domenici and I have spoken up in an independent way, saying something very fundamental to the president and I've spoken to Senator Mitchell, the majority leader, and I've spoken directly to the president. Take the four common points out of both programs: the investment tax credit, the tax allowance for first-time home buyers, a passive loss, and the minimum alternative tax, and throw in the Specter Domenici proposal on consumer purchasing power, and pass a limited economic recovery program. There are many of us who have been independent and who have spoken out and who have played a leadership role. Civil rights bill is a perfect example about how my voice, along with two other key senators, Jack Danforth of Missouri and Jim Jeffords of Vermont, carried that day. I think I can point out, and in very specific terms, what I have done to separate myself out. My contacts in this state. I have had more contacts in my state with my people, keeping a finger on the pulse of Pennsylvania, I think, than virtually anybody else. That's what people are dissatisfied with. They never see their representatives. And I think I can distinguish myself.
Senator, do you support President Bush's policy towards the Haitian boat people? And if so, why?
I do not. I got into a long wrangle on a Harrisburg radio station earlier this week. I do not support his policy there because I do not believe that you can send people back in those rickety boats. I believe that we have to be considerate of refugees. I have a special concern because both of my parents were refugees. We have a policy, Vernon, that we will allow anybody into this country where there's political oppression. That is our policy. It's a good policy, and it ought to be maintained. Now, it's different.
Are they economic or political refugees?
Well, all right, that's the question. And it's not easy to answer. And each one of those people is an individual who has to be judged on an individual basis. But what I think the United States should do is take a leadership role and have the Organization of American States take over. We've got a lot of Western Hemisphere countries who could help out. The oil embargo, we haven't tried to get Europe to take a stand against the upstarts in Haiti to bring back the legitimate government, to stop all this mess.
Many critics say the Bush policy is racially motivated, and he wants to make the Haitians the Willie Hortons of 1992. Do you think it's racist?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. George Bush doesn't have any interest in being bigoted against the Haitians. I think that he sees a real problem as to where you put them in the United States, where you house them, where they're in detention. And I think he sees that our policy is to guard our own borders. But I do not think it is racially motivated at all.
But other immigrants continue to come in from Europe, from Russia, from Southeast Asia.
Vernon,
why them?
Vernon, there are strict quotas on every immigrant who comes in here. There's a 50,000 quota on Jews who come into this country. There's a strict quota on Western Europeans. It's not a matter of the color of your skin.
You heard Pat Buchanan, who ran in the Republican Party this year, say, I'd rather have some white immigrants come in than any blacks. You heard that. Now, is President Bush, you see no racism at all in that policy?
I totally repudiate what Pat Buchanan said on that subject. It is an anathema and horrible, and I do not think that President Bush has one concern on the racial issue on his Haitian policy. I say to you flatly, he's wrong on humanitarian grounds and failure to take leadership for the Organization of American States, but he's not motivated by racial grounds.
The Democratic leadership wants to impose a tax increase on the wealthiest segment of the American people to fund a tax relief mechanism for middle-class Americans. The president has said no, he doesn't like that idea. Where do you fall on that issue?
I believe that if we're to keep a balanced budget and really move against the deficit, that when we take up the issue of entitlements, there may be a role for a tax increase. I have talked to a lot of people in upper income brackets and lower income brackets, and when they talk about the deficit, if we could control the deficit, they'd be willing to talk about it. You talk about H. Ross Perot, he's against taxes totally, and then he says, well, he'd go for some taxes for education. I'm not proposing a tax increase, but I do not think you can rule it out if you really have spending cuts and if you really get our whole economy in shape. I think the worst thing that has happened to this country in the past 30 years has been this horrendous deficit, which has grown up. Lee Iacocca put it right on the line. He says we have stiffed the next generation. I mean, can you imagine spending money and having our grandchildren pay for it? And I think there may well come a time when we're going to have to consider in a totality the entitlement programs, belt-tightening, sacrifices on all lines, and the tax issue will be on the table.
Of course, historically, once upon a time, you were a Democrat.
So was Ronald Reagan.
So was Ronald Reagan. So were a lot of people. 1992, if one were to analyze Arlen Specter's social philosophy, fiscal philosophy, isn't it possible that if you added up all the chips, you look more like a Democrat today than a Republican?
I don't think so, Jim, because my basic approach is a free enterprise system and the market and not a managed economy.
Well, there are a lot of Democrats who feel that way.
Well, listen, if you take a Democrat like Sam Nunn, or a Democrat like Al Gore and I were talking the other day, and he made the comment about how similar our policies were. But I feel comfortable as a Republican. I think it's very important to have a big city Republican inside the Republican caucus. You know, I'm the only person when the 43 Republicans sit down who has experience in what it's like in a big city state.
Let me tap on your political expertise for a minute. Do you think there is a scenario out there where Bill Bradley could be the vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, despite his protestations to the contrary?
No.
No way he takes it.
Or
no way he's offered it.
I don't think Senator Bradley wants to be vice president. I don't think he wants to do that. But invite him on.
Senator, the riots, the uprising in Los Angeles a few weeks ago, Lyndon Johnson got blamed by the White House for it, and Jimmy Carter, and maybe Grover Cleveland eventually. Now it's Murphy Brown. You've heard some of this banter about it back and forth. But hasn't that happened on the Republican watch in the White House? And you were in the U.S. Senate. You talked about the deficit. It's ballooned with the Republicans at the top of the ticket, at the top of the power game there in Washington. What do you say about that? Who carries the blame for this? And with all these budget cuts you talk about and cutting deficits, what's going to happen?
Vernon, I think there's enough blame to go around for everyone. I think what we have to do is today figure out where we're going. That's why I supported the Kennedy-Hatch bill to put $1.45 billion available now, $700 million for youth summer jobs, which Mayor Rendell says is number one, $250 million for Head Start, which Superintendent Clayton wants.
But why did it have to come after the debacle and the tragedy in Los Angeles for the White House to even look at that issue?
Well, it hasn't come after the debacle in Los Angeles for me to look at the issue and for me to have been fighting to bring in money here. We had on Friday a program, Dr. Lewis Sullivan brought in $10 million that I pushed to get from my committee, my seniority on Health and Human Services, job training program in West Philadelphia, federal courts taking over on more of the drug cases, a detention center. We've had a terrible situation in Philadelphia's detention center, which has resulted in a lack of safety on the streets because people have been out who should have been in, and those who are in are there with unconstitutional, cruel, and barbarous treatment conclusions, an $83 million jail, which has come through for Philadelphia, and it's not just me, it's Senator Wofford, Senator Hines before him, Weldon, Follietta, Borski, Coughlin. These things we've been working on for a long time. The riots in Los Angeles have brought them front and center. But we've been working on them for a long time.
We spent the last 30 seconds of the last time you were on this program forcing you to confront the unpleasantness of the movie JFK as far as you were concerned. In the interest of fairness, a couple of pathologists who examined the president's body back in the wake of the assassination said, no, there's no question. It was 2 shots fired by a single gun, and we support the Warren report. How did you react to that?
Well, I didn't think that it was such big news, Jim, because when I talked to Humes and Boswell back in March of '64, they told me that and they testified about it.
Were you upset that they didn't go public until a week
no,
ago?
their testimony was in the record. I think that it may work out that the movie JFK, in the long run, will do more to support the Warren Commission in a curious twist because people have sort of ridiculed the movie as being fictional. And people are coming back, and we're going to...
Once again, on the same subject, I have to interrupt you, just like the last time. We're out of time.
Great pleasure.
Thanks to Senator Specter for being on the program. Thank you also to Vernon Odom. For Election News Issues and Answers, I'm Jim Gardner. We'll see you next week at this time.
From Channel 6, the Delaware Valley's leading news station, this has been Action News, Issues and Answers.